The roar of the hippodrome quickly turned into the cries of a city under siege. Emperor Justinian, the most powerful man in the world, found his throne crumbling beneath him, as Constantinople erupted in a wave of unprecedented violence. This isn't just history, it's a testament to how close a mighty empire came to its end and how it found the will to survive. Justinian and the Nika Riots is often remembered as a tale of last-minute courage. A wavering emperor, a steel-willed empress, a loyal general, and a mob that nearly toppled an empire. That version is not false, yet it can be too. Neat, too comfortable in its certainty that the Roman state was saved by a single speech and a single massacre. Beneath the smoke of 532 lay something more unsettling. The realization that in Constantinople, the empire's capital was not merely a seat of government, but a living political machine, capable of choosing rulers with its acclamation, financing factions with its patronage, and when the gears seized, tearing down the very architecture of imperial authority. In that light, the Nika riots become not an interruption to Justinian's reign, but a violent referendum on what power meant in the 6th century Roman world, and on how fragile that power could be when its public theater turned into a battlefield. Constantinople in the early 6th century was a city that looked like destiny made stone. The sea pressed against its walls, the harbors filled with grain ships and merchant craft. Domes and colonnades drew the eye upward as if the empire's order were a natural part of the sky. Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch the similar video. It was wealthy, crowded, restless. The imperial court resided at the edge of the city's greatest stage, the Hippodrome, a massive arena built for chariot racing and spectacle, stitched directly into the palace complex so that the emperor could be both ruler and performer in the same breath. To modern eyes, sporting factions may appear trivial. To Constantinople, they were structure, social networks with real muscle, real money, and real access. The Blues and the Greens were not political parties in a modern sense, yet neither were they merely fan clubs. They organized neighborhood loyalties. They provided a language through which ordinary citizens, artisans, dock workers, and even the city's elite could express grievance or allegiance. They were mechanisms for collective action in a world where formal political participation had narrowed, where the old republican institutions were long gone, and where the emperor's legitimacy still relied, paradoxically, on public consent performed through applause, acclamation, and ceremonial order. The Hippodrome was where that consent was staged. When the crowd chanted, it was not always about sport, it could be a petition. It could be a warning, it could be judgment. The Orthodox story begins with this combustible setting and adds the familiar fuel. Justinian's hard governance, he came to the throne in 527 with grand ambitions. Legal reform, theological unity, territorial restoration. Ambition required money. The machinery of empire, from the army to the grain supply to the vast palace bureaucracy, ran on taxation and extraction. Justinian's administration, especially the notorious financial rigor associated with officials like John the Cappadocian, could feel to many like a tightening vice. Alongside fiscal pressure were scandals of justice and corruption. Accusations that the courts could be bent, that the powerful were protected, that punishments could be uneven. Even the great legal codification associated with Justinian, for all its later prestige, could be experienced in the moment as disruption and enforcement, law not as abstract ideal, but as the sharp edge of state power. In Constantinople, tension did not simmer quietly. It collected in the places designed for public emotion, the streets, the taverns, the baths, the great processions, and above all the hippodrome. The factions were the city's nerves. The empire's officials could try to discipline them, but they also relied on them to manage crowds and generate the pageantry that projected order. This symbiosis carried a hidden risk. If the emperor became the common target of anger, the factions could stop being a tool of control and become a weapon. The spark arrived on January 13th, 532. The story, preserved in sources such as Procopius and John Malalas, begins with arrests and punishments connected to factional violence. After earlier unrest, some members of the factions were condemned. Executions were scheduled, public, exemplary, meant to reassert the state's authority. Yet the spectacle misfired. In the confusion of the hanging, two condemned men, one associated with the blues, one with the greens in some accounts, survived when the ropes failed. They fled and sought refuge in a church. The crowd, already primed with anger, seized on this as a sign not of mercy but of injustice. Petitions were made for clemency. The emperor refused, or refused enough, and the refusal was heard as contempt. That day in the Hippodrome, the old pattern of factional rivalry broke. Blues and greens, so often enemies, found a shared chant, Nika, victory. It was a cry with ancient resonance, used in races and ceremonies, but now sharpened into a political blade. The crowd shouted not for a team, but for triumph over the regime itself. The Hippodrome, meant to display imperial harmony, became a furnace. What followed was not a simple riot. Constantinople erupted with a fury that suggests planning as much as spontaneity, opportunism as much as outrage. Buildings burned, the old Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was damaged or destroyed. Parts of the city center went up in flames. Offices associated with imperial administration were attacked. The city's geography mattered. The Hippodrome sat beside the palace. The streets around it were arteries of power, lined with monuments meant to dwarf the individual and sanctify the emperor. Now those same spaces became corridors of assault. The empire's symbols were not merely defaced, they were contested. Here the conventional interpretation often pauses to marvel at the suddenness. How could a metropolis so magnificent become a powder keg so quickly? But perhaps that question assumes too much stability. Constantinople was a city where politics had been compressed into performance. The crowd's roar carried real weight because the empire itself still treated acclamation as an ingredient of legitimacy. In an age without elections, the sound of approval mattered. The Hippodrome was a public square with teeth. As the fires spread, something even more dangerous occurred. The riot began to seek a replacement emperor. The mob's anger needed a name to anoint, a vessel for its victory. Attention turned to Hypatius, a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius. He had dynastic blood, and more importantly, he had usefulness. Whether Hypatius desired the throne remains debated, shaded by the source's biases and by the fact that losers rarely control the narrative. Some accounts portray him as reluctant, dragged into a role he feared. Others leave room for suspicion, for the possibility that factions among the elites saw in the chaos an opening. In any case, the crucial fact is this: the rebellion reached beyond protest. It became a revolution in form, if not in coherence. A new emperor was proclaimed amid smoke and stone, and then the unthinkable seemed possible. The Roman Empire, this Eastern Roman state that would later be called Byzantine, might fall not to Persians on the frontier, not to barbarian armies across a river, but to its own capital turning on its ruler. The empire's heart was trying to strangle itself. The fires did not merely light the night, they illuminated the architecture of imperial fragility. That illumination reached the palace walls, and inside those walls, panic found a voice. The palace complex was not simply a residence, it was a fortress of administration, ritual, and guarded corridors. Yet in January 532, it became a trap. Justinian and his court were only steps from the Hippodrome, but those steps might as well have been miles of enemy territory. The proximity that normally allowed the emperor to appear before the people now allowed the people to press their fury against his gates. The city outside was no longer a stage he could command. It was a sea whose waves battered his doors. This is the point where the Orthodox narrative presents Justinian as despairing. Advisors urged flight. Ships could be prepared. The sea offered escape, perhaps to the Asian shore, perhaps to a loyal province where troops could be gathered and a return attempted. Such counsel was not cowardice alone, it was calculation. Emperors had fled before, rulers had abandoned cities to save a dynasty, to preserve a claim, to return with force. Rome's imperial history had seen civil wars sparked by the sudden collapse of authority in the center. A retreat might prevent capture, and humiliation might keep the imperial line alive. And yet flight would be more than movement. In Constantinople, where legitimacy was fused to the city's sacred and ceremonial topography, to leave was to concede. The palace was not just stone, it was the empire's nerve center. The capital was where law, taxation, and military command converged. A fleeing emperor did not simply lose a city, he risked becoming a pretender. Justinian, for all his later reputation as a confident builder of empire, appears in this moment as a man staring into the abyss of his own political experiment. His reign had been an effort to impose order, to systematize law, to discipline administration, to assert theological and imperial unity. The riot mocked those efforts. It suggested that the state's impressive machinery could be jammed by something as raw as public rage, and that the emperor, in the most critical hour, might have no tool more effective than escape. The fear in the palace was not only fear of death, it was fear of meaninglessness, the fear that the long labor of policy, reform, and ceremony could be erased in a week by fire and chanting. In such a crisis, the question is often framed as personal. Would Justinian be brave? Would he stay? Yet courage alone does not hold the throne. Power in an empire is not a possession, it is an arrangement. It depends on guards who obey, generals who commit, bureaucrats who continue to collect and pay, clergy who sanctify, and a city that can be managed. In 532, that arrangement was cracking. To understand what came next, the terms themselves must shift. Riot suggests disorder without aim. Revolution suggests a coherent plan. The Nika crisis was neither in full. It was a struggle over the empire's operating system, who could make commands stick. If Justinian fled, the rebels' acclamation of Hypatius might become self-fulfilling. If Justinian stayed without decisive action, the palace might fall. The imperial court, cornered by the city it ruled, weighed options that were all catastrophic in different ways. In that weighing, another voice entered, a voice later made famous, perhaps polished by retelling, but powerful enough that history has treated it as pivotal. The crisis of the empire narrowed to a crisis in a room, and the room held an empress. Theodora's origins were the kind that court society liked to sneer at and chroniclers liked to sensationalize. Procopius, our most vivid and most problematic witness, gives accounts of her background that have fueled centuries of fascination and controversy. What matters here is not the scandal, but the political fact. Theodora had risen into the imperial center with a mind trained by survival, by performance, by reading crowds and patrons, skills that an elite upbringing did not necessarily provide. In a city where legitimacy was theatrical, Theodora understood theater, and she understood what happened when the show collapsed. The famous speech attributed to her comes down to us most memorably through Procopius's wars. Whether Procopius recorded her words faithfully, shaped them with rhetorical artistry, or constructed them as a dramatic device cannot be proven. Ancient historians often crafted speeches to express what they believed a moment required. Yet even as literature, the speech reflects an argument that fits the situation with unnerving precision. Theodora, in essence, rejected the logic of survival through retreat. She declared that imperial dignity was not something to be carried away like treasure. If the throne could not be held, it was better to die within its purple than live as a fugitive. Purple makes a fine shroud. The phrase is remembered because it is cold. It does not promise victory, it does not flatter. It frames death as preferable to a life emptied of legitimacy. And in doing so, it does something more subtle. It changes the definition of risk. The advisors offered physical safety at the price of political collapse. Theodora offered political coherence at the price of everything else. Her refusal to flee was not only courage, it was a strategic insistence that legitimacy once surrendered is rarely regained on favorable terms. In the palace, such a stance could shame as much as inspire. An emperor surrounded by frightened men is vulnerable to the momentum of fear. Fear loves company. It multiplies in councils and corridors. Theodora's intervention, whatever its exact wording, appears in the sources as a rupture in that momentum. It forced a choice that fear tries to postpone, either abandon the throne or fight for it now. Yet to treat her as merely the fiery spirit in a melodrama is to miss the political intelligence at work. If the capital was the empire's engine, then to leave it during a rival's proclamation was to let that rival inherit the engine intact. Theodora's stance implied a different plan: break the rebellion's cohesion, reclaim the city's central stage, and make it impossible for Hypatius's acclamation to mature into administration. This is where an overlooked factor begins to press through the smoke. The rebellion, for all its size, depended on unity that was fragile. Blues and Greens had joined in fury, but their alliance was unnatural. Their identities were deep habits, not easily erased. Their leaders were susceptible to persuasion, bribery, honor, and threat. Imperial survival did not require persuading the entire city. It required splitting the coalition at the moment it tried to become a government. Theodora's influence in the decision-making of Justinian's court is suggested not only by the speech, but by the coordinated response that followed, mobilizing loyalists, preparing troops, and crucially, exploiting the seams in the rebel alliance. If Justinian stayed, he needed more than bravery. He needed an operation. The palace, still standing amid a city in flames, became a command post. Guards were gathered, messages were sent, offers and threats were prepared. The empire's survival now depended on whether its most capable instruments, generals and officials who could act without hesitation, could turn the city's most dangerous public space back into a controllable arena. That arena was the Hippodrome. The place where the rebellion began would have to become the place where it ended, and for that Justinian needed a man accustomed to impossible missions. Belisarius had already earned the kind of reputation that makes emperors both grateful and wary. A general who wins too much can begin to look like an alternative sovereign. Yet Justinian relied on him, and in 532 reliance became necessity. The enemy now was not a foreign army, but the emperor's own capital. Streets he could not bombard without destroying what he claimed to defend. Crowds he could not negotiate with if their goal had become his replacement. The conventional telling depicts Belisarius as the sword of imperial restoration, the one who carried out the decisive strike. That is true, but it is incomplete. Belisarius' most important weapon in this moment was not force alone, it was timing, coordination, and the willingness to do what political survival sometimes requires, to turn a public gathering into a trap. The Hippodrome, swollen with rebels, was both strong and vulnerable. Strong because it concentrated bodies, passion, and the symbolic power of acclamation. Vulnerable because concentration can be enclosed, the exits could be watched, the crowd's energy could become panic. A mass gathered to proclaim a new emperor can be annihilated if it cannot disperse. Accounts differ in detail, but the broad outlines are consistent. Imperial forces prepared to strike the Hippodrome while the rebels were assembled, and while Hypatia's position as proclaimed emperor was being enacted in the very place where emperors were traditionally acclaimed. There's also a crucial element often treated as a footnote, but central to understanding how the operation succeeded: the splitting of the factions, particularly the Blues. Some sources suggest that an imperial official, often named as Narses, later famous as a general, entered the Hippodrome and spoke to the Blues, reminding them of Justinian's past favor or warning them about what a change of dynasty might mean. The Blues had often been associated, at least in perception, with imperial sympathy. If that sympathy could be reactivated, their commitment to the rebellion could waver. Even a small fracture could be fatal. A crowd united in rage is dangerous. A crowd suddenly unsure is defenseless. Then came the gambit. Belisarius and other commanders, including Mundus in some accounts, moved with troops into the Hippodrome. The very image is chilling. Armored men pushing into an arena built for sport, the emperor's forces reclaiming the theater of legitimacy with steel. In the panic and chaos, escape routes became bottlenecks. The mass of humanity that had shouted victory now found victory turned against it. The result was slaughter. Ancient numbers must be treated with caution, but the figure that echoes through the tradition, around 30,000 dead, conveys the scale as much as the count. Even if the number is inflated, the event was catastrophic. The Hippodrome floor, meant for racing horses, became a killing ground for citizens. To describe it as brutality is accurate, but not sufficient. It was a political act as much as a military one, a demonstration that the emperor's monopoly on force, temporarily challenged, could reassert itself with horrifying clarity. The massacre did not merely punish rioters, it annihilated the possibility that Hypatius' acclamation could be backed by a living crowd. The rebellion's body was cut away in an afternoon. Hypatius was seized and executed despite reports that he had been reluctant. Here again, the sources speak with different emphases. Some portray Justinian as sternly necessary, others imply a vengeful consolidation. But the logic is recognizable across empires. In civil crisis, a rival with dynastic legitimacy cannot be left as a symbol. Symbols outlive mercy. As the blood dried, order returned, not because grievances vanished, but because the equation of power had been rewritten by terror. The imperial state had survived by turning its central civic arena into a grave. The price of stability was not negotiation, but annihilation. And yet, the story does not end with corpses in the Hippodrome. A massacre can end a riot, but it cannot by itself repair legitimacy. The city had burned, the capital's confidence had been shaken. Justinian still faced a deeper question the Nika Riots had revealed. How to govern a metropolis whose collective voice could almost unmake an emperor? The answer would not be given only in decrees. It would be carved into stone and lifted into the sky. In the aftermath, Constantinople was both wounded and malleable. Fires had cleared space, lives had been erased, wealth could be confiscated from the condemned, and the suspected offices could be reshuffled. The administrative and fiscal policies that had helped provoke resentment could be continued with new caution or intensified under the logic that mercy invites defiance. Justinian's power, paradoxically, was stronger after nearly collapsing because the crisis had provided justification for consolidation. Emergency creates permissions that normal times deny, but consolidation alone does not restore the sacred aura of rule. The empire's ideology was not merely coercive, it was theological and ceremonial. Justinian ruled not only as a commander, but as God's representative on earth, the guardian of orthodoxy, the builder of a Christian Roman order. When the old Hagia Sophia was destroyed in the fires, the loss was more than architectural. It was a wound in the empire's claim to divine favor. So Justinian rebuilt, and he rebuilt with a scale that dared the heavens to contradict him. The new Hagia Sophia rose with speed that seemed itself like a statement. The state could command labor, materials, and genius even after catastrophe. Architects' tradition names Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus conceived a structure that was not merely a church but an argument made in space, a dome suspended like a celestial sign, light spilling across marble, a vault suggesting the presence of the divine within imperial order. When it was dedicated in 537, the building proclaimed that the empire had not merely survived, it had been transfigured by crisis. Yet Hagia Sophia was not only a hymn in stone, it was also a warning, a monument built atop the memory of the riot that made its construction possible. To walk beneath its dome was to inhabit a city remade by the consequences of rebellion. The same government that had slaughtered tens of thousands could also marshal resources for transcendent beauty. The empire's resilience was forged in fire and blood, and Justinian seemed determined that the city would remember both, though not equally. The Nika Riots also cast a long shadow over Justinian's later ambitions. It is tempting to see his subsequent projects, the codification of Roman law, the reconquest campaigns in Italy and North Africa, the relentless push for doctrinal unity, as simply the unfolding of an original plan. But the near overthrow of 532 suggests another reading, that Justinian's grand program was sharpened by trauma. After a ruler sees his capital proclaim another emperor, control becomes more precious, dissent more dangerous, and glory more necessary. The state's assertion abroad can be in part compensation for insecurity at home, a way to project inevitability when the ruler has tasted contingency. Here, the overlooked factor becomes decisive. The Nika riots were not merely an explosion of popular anger. They were a breakdown in the systems that mediated between ruler and ruled. The factions were not outside the political order. They were one of its organs. When that organ turned malignant, the empire's response was surgical and brutal. Remove the tissue, cauterize the wound, rebuild the body stronger, and ensure the center can never again be held hostage by its own theater. Different historians have weighed these elements differently. Some emphasize the riot as a spontaneous urban catastrophe, a crowd momentarily unified by outrage and opportunism. Others treat it as an elite power struggle that used the crowd as muscle, pointing to Hypatia's dynastic credentials and the speed with which an alternative was proclaimed. Still others rate it as a symptom of deeper structural tension. An empire trying to centralize revenue and authority in a city whose populace had learned over generations that the hippodrome was a place where emperors could be praised, mocked, petitioned, and if necessary challenged. The truth may not belong entirely to one interpretation. The Nika crisis was likely all of these at once. Popular fury with real grievances, elite maneuvering with real calculation, and structural instability embedded in the way Constantinople performed politics. In that layered reality, the celebrated figures, Justinian, Theodora, Belisarius, remain central, but their significance changes. Justinian becomes not simply a great emperor nearly toppled by a mob, but a ruler caught between a universal vision of imperial order and the local volatility of his own capital. Theodora becomes not simply the courageous woman who saved a throne, but a political mind who understood that legitimacy is a thing that must be held in place, sometimes by refusing the very instinct to survive. Belisarius becomes not merely the loyal general, but the executor of a terrifying principle, that the empire's public theater could be reclaimed only by turning it into an instrument of death. After 532, the empire did not become unshakable. It would face plague, war, and religious fracture. Justinian's reconquests would strain resources and provoke debate among later historians about cost and benefit, glory and overreach. Yet the Nika riots ensured that the regime's memory was marked by one searing lesson. The capital's crowd was not background noise. It was a political force that could not be ignored, only managed through patronage, through intimidation, through spectacle, and through the careful construction of symbols powerful enough to command awe. In the end, the Nika riots resist being reduced to a simple parable of courage or cruelty. They reveal an empire whose strength lay not in the absence of internal threats, but in its capacity to absorb them, sometimes by reform, sometimes by force, and often by turning catastrophe into architecture. Constantinople burned, and from its ashes rose a dome that still seems to float above history. But beneath that dome lingered the memory of a different kind of monument. Hippodrome, where the people had shouted victory against their emperor, and where the emperor answered in steel. Justinian's reign would be remembered for laws and churches, campaigns and councils. Yet the Nika riots remain its most intimate revelation, the moment when the most powerful man in the world discovered that power was not simply command. It was the ability to keep a city, its factions, its elites, its crowds, its symbols, from deciding that the empire could do without him. And for a few days in January 532, Constantinople decided it could. Then, through a convergence of resolve, calculation, persuasion, and massacre, it decided otherwise. The fires went out, the stones cooled. The empire continued, but it continued differently, as if it had looked into its own end and turned away, not unscarred, not purified, but made more conscious of the terrible mathematics that sustain states: legitimacy, fear, splendor, and the thin, combustible line between a roar of celebration and the sound of a city under siege. Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch the similar video.